The vast Texas sky was a canvas of fire and gold as the sun bled out over the horizon, its dying light casting long, skeletal shadows from the barbed wire fences of Camp Hearn. This was one of many prisoner-of-war camps, a hidden archipelago of captivity scattered across the Lone Star State in the pivotal year of 1944. The air itself was a tapestry of scents, the dry, sweet smell of prairie dust, the sharp tang of human sweat, and the distant, ghostly aroma of wood smoke from ranch house chimneys. As the day's labor concluded, a line of weary figures formed for the evening roll call. Among them stood Anna Kruger, a 28-year-old German nurse whose war had ended in the chaos of France, only to be transported to a landscape she could never have imagined. America, the land of the enemy, was supposed to be a place of brutality, a caricature painted by propaganda leaflets. She maintained a posture of rigid discipline, a shield against the unfamiliar, her blonde hair tucked under a simple kerchief, her face a testament to the unforgiving Texas sun. Across the compound, his boots planted firmly in the dust, stood Joe Carter. He was a man carved from the very land he guarded, tall, with the broad shoulders of a man accustomed to hard labor, his Stetson pulled low over his eyes. He was not a soldier by trade or temperament. He was a rancher, a man who understood the language of horses and cattle far better than the mechanics of warfare. To him, the prisoners were not faceless enemies, but an unexpected source of labor, people to be managed with a sense of pragmatic fairness. When the whistle signaled the end of roll call, the prisoners began to disperse. Then a sudden, capricious gust of wind, a common visitor on the plains, tore through the yard. It snatched Anna's kerchief from her head, sending it skittering across the dusty ground like a leaf. She froze, a prisoner of protocol, uncertain if movement was permitted. In that moment of hesitation, Joe acted. He did not shout or command. He simply stepped forward, bent down, and with a gesture that was both simple and profound, he lifted his own sweat-stained Stetson and placed it gently upon her head. A silence, heavy and profound, fell over Camp Hearn. The casual chatter of the guards ceased. The low murmurs of the German prisoners died in their throats. All eyes were fixed on this small, monumental act. Anna stood transfixed, her eyes wide, her hands trembling slightly. The world had narrowed to the weight of the hat on her head, the scent of leather and sun and tobacco that enveloped her. It was a gesture that defied all the rules of war, a crack in the immense ideological wall that separated captor from captive, conqueror from conquered. That night, in the Spartan confines of the women's barracks, Anna could not sleep. She sat on the edge of her bunk, her fingers tracing the worn brim of the cowboy hat. It was more than an article of clothing, it was an artifact from a different world, a world where an enemy had offered not hostility, but a simple, wordless respect, something her own officers, with their fanatical devotion to hardness, had never afforded her. By the next morning, the story had woven itself into the very fabric of the camp. The cowboy gave her his hat. The whisper traveled, from prisoner to prisoner, from guard to guard. The moment had transcended the ordinary and entered the realm of legend, a seed of humanity planted in the barren soil of war. Long before Anna had ever set foot in Texas, her mind had been conditioned by fear. In the dimly lit underground hospitals of occupied France, the voice of German radio had been a constant drumbeat of warning. It painted America as a nation of savages, where captured soldiers were beaten and starved, and women were subjected to unspeakable horrors. Never surrender to the Anglo-Saxons, her commanding nurse had intoned, her voice grave. They are not a civilized people. These words became a mantra, a shield she carried with her through the disorienting shock of capture, the tumultuous journey across the cold, grey Atlantic. When the train doors finally screeched open in Texas, revealing a landscape of blinding light and searing heat, she braced herself for the humiliation she had been promised. Instead, she was met with confusion. The guards did not bark with animalistic fury. They offered canteens of water. A sergeant with a drawl as slow as a meandering river joked that the new arrivals looked like they could use a decent meal and a good night's sleep. This was not the enemy she had been trained to despise. This suspicion was a two-way street. For many Americans, the war was a deeply personal wound. They had lost brothers on the beaches of Normandy, sons in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and friends in the vast, silent depths of the ocean. The news that German prisoners, including women, were being housed and fed on American soil was a bitter pill for some to swallow. "We're feeding the devils that killed our boys," a local ranch hand had grumbled, his voice thick with resentment. "It just ain't right." Yet the official policy of the United States Army was unwavering and clear. All prisoners would be treated in strict accordance with the Geneva Convention. They would receive adequate food, medical care, and would work under humane conditions. While a world war raged across the oceans, here, on American soil, a different kind of victory was being pursued, a victory of decency and principle. Driven by a mix of outrage and morbid curiosity, locals would sometimes gather at the camp's perimeter fence, expecting to glimpse monstrous incarnations of the Nazi ideology. Instead, they saw sunburned, tired faces, women who looked disconcertingly like their own daughters or sisters. Inside the wire, the German prisoners were equally confounded. They struggled to reconcile the America they saw with the one they had been taught to fear. The Americans smiled too easily. One woman confided to her journal. "It feels deceptive, like a carefully laid trap." When Anna was assigned to duties in the camp infirmary, she maintained a wall of cold, silent defiance. Every friendly laugh from a guard put her on edge. Every small kindness felt like a test of her loyalty. But the relentless, mundane rhythm of daily life began to wear down the barriers. A shared moment of amusement when a horse spooked at its own shadow, a silent nod of acknowledgement over a completed task, an unspoken respect when a cowboy helped one of the older women lift a heavy water barrel. The propaganda on both sides was built upon a foundation of fear. Fear of the other, fear of betrayal, fear that any display of compassion was a fatal weakness. Yet it was this very compassion, expressed in these small, ordinary moments, that began to dismantle the myths, brick by brick. By the end of her first month, Anna could no longer convincingly pretend she was surrounded by monsters. They were just men, with dusty boots and weary eyes, working the same land under the same immense sky. And though it was never spoken aloud, something fragile and revolutionary was beginning to take root. Trust. By 1944, the United States had become a nation dotted with internment facilities, a vast, unpublicized network of barbed wire and guard towers stretching from the Great Plains to the Gulf Coast. Texas, with its sprawling open spaces and its robust agricultural economy, became the epicenter of this system. Nearly 70 POW camps were established across the state, from the piney woods of the east to the arid flatlands of the west. Camp Hearn alone was a small, self-contained city of nearly 5,000 captured Axis soldiers, which included a small contingent of women, nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries who had been caught up in the turbulent collapse of the German occupation in France. For the local Texan population, the concept of female prisoners of war was almost incomprehensible. Yet the U.S. Army's logic was pragmatic. The war had siphoned off the nation's manpower. Ranchers and farmers were desperate for labor. The fields of cotton and wheat still needed to be harvested, the fences mended, the livestock tended. The men who would have performed this work were thousands of miles away, fighting. German prisoners, both men and eventually women like Anna, became the unforeseen solution to a critical domestic need. Initially, the Texas ranchers were deeply skeptical. The idea of entrusting valuable livestock and crops to the very people they were fighting against seemed like madness. However, when the first work details were sent out under guard, a remarkable transformation occurred. The Germans, perhaps to prove their own worth even in captivity, worked with a disciplined efficiency that impressed their captors. And the Texans, bound by an inherent, deeply ingrained code of fair play, responded in kind, treating the prisoners with a respect that transcended the circumstances. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were to be paid for their labor, albeit in camp-specific tokens rather than U.S. currency. In the camp canteens, these tokens could be exchanged for small luxuries: cigarettes, Coca-Cola, chocolate, writing paper, items that had become distant memories in war-ravaged Europe. For the prisoners, these tokens were more than a currency. They were a tangible symbol of their retained dignity. The conditions within the camps were far superior to anything they had been led to expect. They lived in wooden barracks equipped with electricity and running water, received medical care, and had access to mail, libraries, and even musical instruments. Some camps organized their own orchestras, theater groups, and published newsletters in German. Yet, beneath this surface of civility, a profound moral tension simmered. Every newspaper that found its way into the camp carried stark headlines detailing the destruction of German cities: Dresden, Cologne, Hamburg. The same nation that provided them with 3 meals a day and medical attention was systematically reducing their homeland to rubble. This contradiction was a constant, unsettling presence in their lives. The arrival of the first female POWs added another layer of complexity. The guards were uncertain how to behave. Should they be stern disciplinarians or extend old-fashioned Southern courtesy? The rules seemed to be rewritten daily. Anna's group of 24 women was housed in a separate compound. Their work was primarily agricultural: harvesting vegetables, milking cows, sorting animal feed. Their guards were often local reservists and cowboys, men more comfortable with a lasso than a rifle, who referred to the women as Fräuleins, with a mixture of curiosity and rustic chivalry. Joe Carter was one of these men. He was a rancher who had lost 2 brothers in the European theater. When he was first assigned to guard Hitler's women, he had responded with a bitter, cynical laugh. But when he saw them step down from the transport trucks, thin, sunburned, their eyes hollowed by war, yet still holding a spark of defiant pride, his perspective shifted. "These ain't Nazis," he later told his commanding officer in his straightforward manner. "They're just folks who ran out of luck." The POW program in Texas would ultimately be recorded as one of the most successful logistical and humanitarian operations of its kind. The local farms prospered, the economy received a vital boost, and countless Texans found themselves re-evaluating the very definition of the word enemy. But for Anna and Joe, this transformation was not a matter of policy or statistics. It was about to become deeply, undeniably personal. The scale of the American POW operation was staggering. By the end of 1944, the United States was holding over 376,000 Axis prisoners within its borders. Texas alone accounted for nearly 70,000 of them, the largest single concentration of POWs on American soil. The camp logistics operated with machine-like precision. Every day, hundreds of thousands of meals were prepared, vast tracts of farmland were cultivated, and countless letters were censored and dispatched across the ocean. Each prisoner was allotted a daily ration of 3,200 calories, a quantity that exceeded the rations of many American civilians, and was far beyond what German citizens, struggling with severe shortages, could ever hope to see. The food was not mere subsistence. It included fresh eggs, bread, butter, vegetables, coffee, and even a special Sunday roast. In total, American taxpayers spent the colossal sum of nearly $1.2 billion to maintain the POW system. Funds that could have been directed toward bombs and bullets were instead invested in feeding the enemy. This was a strategic decision as much as a moral one. The War Department was determined to demonstrate that the American way of life, founded on principles of fair treatment, order, and human efficiency, was a force more powerful than any ideology built on fear and hatred. The German prisoners could not help but notice the disparity. They compared their circumstances in hushed conversations within their barracks. If this is how they treat their enemies, one man pondered aloud, then what must it be like to be their friend? This question lingered, haunting and unanswerable. Meanwhile, letters from home told a different story. One of starvation in Hamburg, of families huddling in bombed-out ruins, of children foraging for scraps of food. In Texas, these same Germans were harvesting fresh peaches from orchard trees and enjoying cold bottles of Coca-Cola during their breaks. The contrast was psychologically jarring, creating a turbulent mix of gratitude and guilt, relief and shame. Anna witnessed this paradox daily in her work at the infirmary. As a nurse, she assisted in treating a range of ailments, from sprained ankles to severe sunburns, for both prisoners and guards alike. The camp doctor, a pragmatic American medic named Lewis, often summed up the philosophy of the place with a gruff, "Around here, blood is just blood. It don't wear a flag." This simple, profound sentiment did more to change hearts and minds than any official pronouncement ever could. The industrial and logistical might of America told one story, a story of overwhelming power. But beneath those numbers lay a deeper, more powerful narrative, the moral calculus of mercy. Every shared meal, every offered cigarette, every act of common decency that crossed the barbed wire fence was another blow against the foundation of Nazi propaganda. These prisoners had been raised to believe in the virtue of hardness and the weakness of mercy. Yet here, under the vast Texas sky, mercy was the operating system, organized, deliberate, and relentless. One historian would later reflect, "The United States did not just win World War II with weapons, it won with calories, engines, and conscience." In this arithmetic of humanity, the balance was steadily, irrevocably shifting. The days at Camp Hearn moved to a rhythm that the distant war could not disrupt. Revel at dawn, roll call, the march to work details, lunch under the open sky, evening assembly, and lights out at 10 p.m. But for Anna, the relentless passage of days had begun to feel less like a punishment and more like a strange, suspended peace. Her work crew was assigned to a nearby ranch where German prisoners helped with the cotton harvest and the care of livestock. The guards were Texans through and through, men who could read the mood of a horse in the flick of its ear faster than they could pass a military manual. They were men who had learned patience from the land itself. Joe Carter was among them. He had grown up a mere 20 miles from the camp, the son of a rancher who had himself fought in the Great War. Joe had volunteered after the attack on Pearl Harbor, endured the loss of his 2 brothers, and through a twist of fate, found himself guarding the very people he had once blamed for his grief. When the trucks carrying the German women first arrived, his anger had been a cold, hard knot in his chest. "They're the enemy, not guests," he had muttered to the camp doctor. But sustaining such pure anger proved difficult under the wide, impartial Texas sky. His first real interaction with Anna was emblematic of the shift. She was struggling, her face set in a mask of stubborn determination, trying to lift a feed sack that was nearly as heavy as she was. She refused help even as the burlap tore and grain spilled onto the ground around her boots. The other prisoners laughed nervously. Joe did not. He simply walked over, handed her an empty sack, and said in his quiet, steady voice, "Try again, ma'am." That single word, "ma'am," struck her with the force of a physical blow. No German officer had ever addressed her with such inherent respect. She straightened her shoulders, swallowed her pride, and tried again. He didn't mock her when she stumbled, nor did he offer empty praise. He simply watched with the calm, assessing gaze of a man familiar with both the cycles of life and the finality of death, and who knew better than to rush either. That night, in the barracks, Anna replayed the moment in her mind. Why would an enemy show her respect? What was the strategy behind such a gesture? In the weeks that followed, their paths crossed frequently. He showed the women how to properly tie feed bags, how to balance hay bales on the backs of mules, how to use a low whistle to calm a nervous horse. He was a man of few words and rare smiles, but when he did smile, it was genuine, crinkling the corners of his eyes and causing a strange, fleeting sense of normalcy to descend upon the work detail. Anna's English improved word by painful word. She learned, "Thank you," "Good morning," and "Too hot." Joe, in turn, picked up a few phrases of German. When he offered her a dipper of water, he'd sometimes grin and say, "Wasser?" She would roll her eyes but accept it, a small crack appearing in her facade. Then came the day of the windstorm, the day the hat blew away. It was a sudden, violent squall that swept across the prairie, whipping up dust devils and sending papers flying. Anna's kerchief was torn from her head and carried on a gust toward the horse corrals. Her hand instinctively shot out, then froze mid-air. A guard shouted, "Hold!" But the wind was a louder command. Before anyone could react, Joe moved. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, he took the Stetson from his own head, the hat that was as much a part of his identity as his own shadow, and placed it on hers. It settled awkwardly, the wide brim casting a shadow over her face. The entire world seemed to stop. The guards halted their movements. The prisoners fell into a stunned silence. A line, invisible but deeply felt, had been crossed. The hat was no longer just an object. It was a bridge. Anna felt her throat tighten. For the first time since her capture, she was seen not as a prisoner, a nurse, or a German, but simply as a person. Joe gave a single, curt nod, turned on his heel, and went back to work as if nothing of consequence had occurred. But for everyone present, the universe had subtly, permanently realigned itself. That night, the story spread not as gossip, but as gospel. The cowboy had given his hat to the German woman. It was an act not of command, nor of condescension, but of pure, unadulterated respect. And respect, they were discovering, was a more potent and dangerous force than any weapon yet devised. For years, the identities of both sides had been constructed upon carefully cultivated illusions. To the Germans, America was a decadent, weak society, obsessed with jazz music, chewing gum, and shallow materialism. To the Americans, Germany was a cold, unfeeling machine of fanaticism, built upon blind obedience and ruthless cruelty. At Camp Hearn, these two powerful myths were colliding in real time, and the collision was revealing a surprising truth. Nazi propaganda had insisted that surrender was a fate worse than death, depicting Allied POW camps as hellscapes of humiliation and starvation. "Better to die a soldier than live a slave," the posters had proclaimed. But the reality in Texas refused to conform to the narrative. Here, each prisoner was provided with a mattress, 3 substantial meals, and 8 hours of rest. They were paid for their labor. They could purchase small comforts. They formed orchestras and art classes. Anna had been raised in a system that taught compassion was a fatal flaw and mercy a luxury for the weak. Yet here she was, living proof of the opposite. America's mercy was not a sentimental impulse. It was systemic, engineered with the same efficiency that produced bombers and tanks. The same supply chains that fueled the war machine were now ensuring the well-being of its captives. Meanwhile, letters from Texas, carefully censored but still revealing, found their way to families in Munich, Berlin, and Bremen. "The Americans treat us fairly," one prisoner wrote. "We have meat, coffee, music. They even let us work with horses." By 1945, German morale was fracturing, not only from military defeat, but from the quiet, psychological shock of discovering that their enemy had refused to become the monster they were told to fear. Even among the American guards, this cognitive dissonance was palpable. Joe Carter's commanding officer once questioned him, "You going soft on them Krauts, Carter?" Joe had merely shrugged, his gaze steady. "Just doing my job, sir. Feeding folks, not fighting them." But the truth was evident to all. Joe had changed. His small act with the hat had acted as a catalyst, a contagion of decency that spread through the camp. Guards began to address prisoners by their first names. Prisoners ceased their subtle acts of defiance. The physical fences remained, but the emotional and psychological barriers were crumbling day by day. Anna, too, was undergoing a profound transformation. The simmering anger she had carried from Europe, the unwavering belief in the righteousness of her cause, began to dissolve in the face of persistent, inexplicable kindness. One morning, while serving coffee in the infirmary, she overheard two guards joking about turning those fancy German cars into scrap metal. To her own astonishment, she laughed. It was the first time she had genuinely understood their humor, their unique ability to confront tragedy with a wry smile and persevere. This was the silent, mathematical collapse of an ideology. Exposure to sustained kindness was systematically dismantling everything that years of indoctrination and cruelty had built. Hitler's Germany had promised victory through total hardness, through steel and an unwavering will. But the new arithmetic of this war was no longer in its favor. The Americans had demonstrated that empathy could be industrialized, that it could be organized and even be made profitable. Every prisoner working a Texas ranch freed an American soldier to fight overseas. Every loaf of bread shared was a calculated act, not a charitable one. The Nazi dream depended entirely on the dehumanization of the enemy. The American system, for all its flaws, was proving its resilience through a process of humanization. By the spring of 1945, even the most stubborn German prisoners could see how the equation was resolving. One side was running out of fuel, soldiers, and most critically, faith. The other was running on an unexpected combination of compassion, efficiency, and astonishing material abundance. For Anna, this realization did not come from a newspaper headline or a radio broadcast. It came from the weight of a hat on her head, from a single, wordless gesture in the dusty stillness of a Texas evening, a silence that felt more powerful than any speech ever written. By April 1945, the rumors reaching Camp Hearn were no longer deniable. Germany was collapsing. The words "Berlin is surrounded" were whispered with a sense of stunned disbelief. The war, which had defined the parameters of their existence for years, was dissolving into history thousands of miles away. But in Texas, the mundane rhythms of life persisted. The sky remained a brilliant blue, the air still carried the scent of mesquite, and the camp radio continued to play upbeat swing music at sunset. One afternoon, having finished her shift at the infirmary, Anna was granted time to write a letter home. She sat at a simple wooden desk in the camp library, a room lined with donated books and dominated by a large American flag on the far wall. Dipping her pen into the inkwell, her hand trembled slightly. Her previous letters had been heavily censored, whole paragraphs obliterated by black ink. This time, she resolved to write with clarity and honesty. The words came slowly at first, then began to flow. "Dear Mama," she began, "I am alive. Texas is nothing like the war. It is hot, dry, and so vast the horizon seems infinite. The people are strange. They are loud and proud, but they are not cruel. They have food, music, and laughter in abundance. They work hard, but they do not seem to harbor hate." She paused, gathering her thoughts, then continued. "We are treated with fairness. We work with animals and crops. Sometimes the guards share their coffee with us. One man, an American cowboy, gave me his hat. I still do not fully understand why. Perhaps to them, mercy is not a weakness but a kind of strength." That single profound sentence, "Mercy is a kind of strength," would pass by the censor unnoticed. It would travel across the ocean, a fragile paper vessel carrying a revolutionary idea, to a bomb-damaged apartment in Bremen. There, her mother, wrapped in a thin coat against the cold, would read the words aloud to her neighbors. The message would spread from one household to another, a small spark of truth in the overwhelming darkness. "The Americans are not what we were told." People would murmur. "They are strong because they are kind." Back in Texas, Joe Carter heard that Anna had written a letter. He didn't inquire about its contents, but he sensed its significance. Later that day, while delivering water barrels, he stopped by the fence of the women's barracks. "You write home?" he asked, his voice casual. Anna nodded. "Yes, I told them," she said, searching for the right English words, "that you are not evil." Joe chuckled, a low, warm sound. "Well, I suppose that's a start." She smiled then, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed her face. "Maybe in my next letter, I will tell them you have no horns." He tipped his hat, now laughing freely. "Now, don't go ruining our reputation completely." That brief, almost playful exchange created ripples that extended far beyond the two of them. It was a glimpse of how wars truly end, long before the official documents are signed. In the moment when enemies find a shared joke, a common thread of humanity. As Allied forces pushed across the Rhine River, the atmosphere in the Texas camps grew somber and reflective. The guards became more subdued. The prisoners wrote more letters, trying to grasp the contours of an uncertain future. Everyone could feel the war's final calculation approaching its inevitable sum. Anna still wore the cowboy hat on occasion, not as a trophy of war, but as a reminder of something more valuable than mere peace, the gift of recognition. That night, before lights out, she added a final conclusive line to her journal. "Perhaps we were wrong about who the barbarians were." May 8, 1945. The Texas sun rose, as it always had, but the air was charged with a new, electric stillness. The camp loudspeakers, typically used for mundane announcements, crackled to life. Then came the voice of the camp commander, measured and solemn, each word falling like a stone into a still pond. "The German Reich has surrendered unconditionally." For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. The prisoners stood as if turned to stone in the yard, the only sound the lonely whisper of the wind through the barbed wire. Then, a low murmur began to rise, a wave of disbelief, grief, and stunned acceptance. Some men removed their caps in a gesture of mourning. Others stared blankly at the ground, their worldviews shattered. A few turned away, their shoulders slumped in defeat. Anna Kruger felt a profound weakness in her knees. She had known this day was coming, but the official pronouncement made it devastatingly real. The Reich, with all its flags, its salutes, its ironclad certainty, was gone. The foundation of her adult life had vanished into static. From his post, Joe Carter watched the scene unfold. He had been given no special instructions for this day, only to maintain order. But what he witnessed was not disorder. It was the raw human aftermath of colossal defeat. He saw shock, heartbreak, and a strange, dawning sense of relief. One German officer, his uniform still impeccably pressed, strode into the center of the yard and shouted, "Lies! All lies!" His voice broke on the words, echoing pathetically against the barracks walls. A young guard instinctively raised his rifle, but Joe gently pushed the barrel down. "Let him be," he said quietly. "He's already lost everything that made him a threat." Later, a small group of prisoners gathered silently by the perimeter fence. The guards did not intervene. They stood together, a somber congregation, gazing out at the immense, untamed land that now seemed to mock the collapse of their old empire. Anna sat apart from the others, the cowboy hat resting in her lap. The brim was frayed, the sweatband darkened, but to her it was an object of immense value. Joe approached her slowly, carrying 2 tin cups of steaming coffee. "Heard the news?" he asked, his voice soft. She nodded, her eyes glistening. "It is finished." "Yep," he said, settling onto the ground on his side of the fence. "World's a mighty small place now." Anna's composure broke, and tears she had held back for years finally fell. "All that we believed, everything, gone." Joe took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning its descent. "Sometimes," he said, "that's the only way you get to start over." They sat together in a comfortable silence as the daylight faded. Behind them, the camp loudspeakers played a crackling, staticky rendition of "The Star-Spangled Banner." Some of the prisoners stood out of respect, others did not. But no one mocked it. At dinner that evening, an extraordinary event occurred. The mess hall served the usual fare: bacon, bread, beans. But before the guards began to eat, an older German prisoner, a man who had once been a teacher, stood up and raised his cup. "To peace," he said, his English heavily accented but clear. The room fell into a hushed silence. Then, slowly, almost hesitantly, every person in the hall, German and American, prisoner and guard, raised their own cup. For the first time since the war began, no one in that room was on an opposing side. They were simply human beings, sharing a moment of collective hope and exhaustion. That night, during his final patrol, Joe passed the women's barracks and saw Anna sitting by the window, the hat still on her head, her face turned toward the stars. She noticed him and offered a single, slow nod. He returned the gesture. No words were necessary. The war that had defined their relationship was over, and in its place was a quiet understanding beneath a shared sky. A soldier and a prisoner, both contemplating the uncertain demands of peace. Germany's surrender ended a global catastrophe, but inside the confines of Camp Hearn, it also ended a more intimate conflict, the war that had been waged within individual hearts. For months, hatred had been a reflex, distrust a habit. Now, in the strange calm that followed the announcement, a new sensibility began to take root. The prisoners were no longer enemies. They were people awaiting repatriation to homes that might no longer exist. The guards were no longer jailers. They were the temporary custodians of history's aftermath. And between them, small symbols of shared humanity persisted. A cowboy hat, a shared cup of coffee, a mutual appreciation of a silent, starry night. Anna wore the hat every day until her transfer orders arrived. To the Americans, it had become a harmless eccentricity. To the Germans, it was a sacred relic, a testament that personal dignity could endure even in the face of national defeat. When Joe learned she was being sent to a processing camp in Louisiana for eventual repatriation, he was quiet for a long time. He finally sought her out at roll call and simply held out his hand. "You'll be going home soon," he said. "Home's a good thing." Anna nodded, her eyes once again filling with tears. "And what if there is no home to return to?" Joe hesitated, then offered the only truth he knew. "Then you build a new one." She smiled, a tired but resilient smile, and took his hand. "You gave me more than a hat, Joe," she said softly. "You gave me back my name." In her final letter from Camp Hearn, Anna wrote, "The war taught us how to destroy. Texas taught me how to live again. When the train pulled out that night, its steam blending with the cool air, the guards stood along the tracks, watching the prisoners wave from between the slats of the cattle cars. Joe lifted his hand in a silent farewell, his figure silhouetted by the flickering station lights. Anna pressed the brim of the hat against the cold glass of the window and whispered, "Danke." The sound was stolen by the wind and the screech of the train, but Joe felt it nonetheless. Years later, historians would document the grand narrative of World War II, the epic battles, the industrial output, the geopolitical shifts. But few would chronicle these quieter victories, the mercy shown in a Texas field, the respect that transcended barbed wire, the simple gestures that dismantled entire empires of lies. Because when the final numbers were tallied, the bombs dropped, the ships sunk, the lives lost, one enduring truth remained. The United States had not won the war solely through its industrial and military might. It had also won a profound moral victory, a victory secured by the resilience of the human heart. In the archived records of Camp Hearn, a single photograph survives. It shows a young German woman, her hair tucked under a cowboy hat, looking directly into the camera. Her eyes are calm, and there is the faintest hint of a smile on her lips. On the back, in faded pencil, someone wrote, "Given by Joe Carter, 1945. Hat returned by mail, 1952. The ultimate fate of Anna Kruger after she left Texas remains a mystery. But in that brief, handwritten note, history has preserved its own quiet message. That wars truly end not when armistices are signed, but when acts of mercy are transformed into lasting memory. The cowboy hat, once merely leather and felt, had become something far greater, a silent monument to the day that simple human compassion triumphed over rigid ideology. When the last prisoner trains departed Texas in 1946, a profound quiet settled over the ranches. The barbed wire was dismantled, the guard towers stood empty, and the land slowly began to reclaim the parade grounds and foundations. Within a few years, wildflowers and prairie grass would blanket the places where soldiers had once marched. The past faded into dust and local legend. But the legacy of those years, when enemies were transformed into neighbors and the hard edges of war were softened by shared humanity, endured in small, ordinary ways. A hat preserved as a family heirloom, a bundle of letters tied with ribbon in a drawer, a faded photograph of a young German woman smiling beneath the wide Texas sky. For many of the prisoners, their time in America was more than an interval of captivity. It was a profound revelation. They had been conditioned by propaganda to expect monstrous treatment. Instead, they encountered cowboys who shared their cigarettes, guards who allowed them to listen to the radio on quiet evenings, and cooks who ensured they never went hungry. This reality shattered the lies they had been taught, and from that shattering emerged something far more powerful than the experience of defeat. It was the dawn of a new understanding. Anna Kruger's story became one of thousands that quietly reverberated across a post-war Europe struggling to rebuild. Some former prisoners corresponded with their former captors for years, sending photographs of new families and children born into peace. Others would make pilgrimages back to Texas decades later, standing in the open fields where the camps had once been, hat in hand, remembering the unexpected kindness they had found in a time of global hatred. Historians would later describe the American POW program as one of the most humane in modern history. But for those who lived through it, no policy document or statistic could ever truly capture the essence of the experience. The war had concluded in a cataclysm of blood and fire across 2 continents. But in a corner of Texas, it had ended with a different kind of force. The power of mercy, an act of grace disguised as simple, everyday decency. Joe Carter never saw Anna again. He returned to his ranch, raising cattle through seasons of drought and plenty. But sometimes, when the evening wind swept across the plains, stirring the grasses, he would look toward the western horizon and remember the young woman who had journeyed across an ocean and through a wall of ideology only to discover the transformative power of kindness. He kept one memento from those war years, a letter written in a careful European script. It read, "Dear Joe, you taught me something no book or flag ever could. You taught me that goodness is ultimately stronger than hate, and that true freedom means not being compelled to hate anyone. Thank you for the hat, for the shared laughter, and for the comfortable silence we shared." It was signed simply, Anna. The paper yellowed and grew brittle with the passing decades, but the words themselves remained, indelible. In the end, that was the quiet miracle of Texas. It was not a story of victory achieved through superior weaponry, but one of redemption found through basic human decency. The cowboys and the prisoners, the guards and the captives, they had all arrived at the same fundamental truth. While war has the power to divide nations, our shared humanity possesses the even greater power to unite individual hearts.